in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a partnerships and community manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Merary Soto-Saunders. She is the Global Head of Human Resources at CVC Credit Partners. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and this can be literally anything, but what has recently brought you joy?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. As you said, my name's Merary Soto-Saunders. My pronouns are she, her. And what has recently brought me joy is I would say watching my 1-year-old, 16-month-old, 1-year-old son finally enjoy painting.
Oh, fun.
Yes, before he didn't really have, he's only 16 months, but he didn't really have the attention span for it. And now he's like full on into it, making a mess, but into it nonetheless.
Using those creative genes. I love to see that.
Yes. I'm like, what are you gonna do? It's interesting to see, kids learn new things and grow, but it's just nice to see when they get into something.
Absolutely.
At least for me, it is.
That moment of flow and just like seeing all the colors. I love it. I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, I'm like, no pressure, be an artist.
Or use the right or left side of the brain. I always forget.
Exactly. I think it's the left, the creative side.
That's what it is. I always like to ask the kind of why behind the work that, folks do on the show as well. And how do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point to be specifically at, CVC Credit Partners and also the global head of human resources there leading the team?
Yeah, I happen to be one of those corny people that really believes that they're in the right, and you know what, I'll take away corny. I would say fortunate people that believe that they're in the right career and place for them, right? So for me, actually, when I was as early as high school, I was interning at Goldman Sachs, and then through college as well. And so for some time, I thought I was going to be an investment banker or an analyst of some sort. And as I started to just expand my career, I'm a New Yorker, even though I live and work in London, or I'm based in London. I was very much integrated into the financial services space of New York City. And so I thought that that's where my career was going. But I will say that I took some risks and some adventures. I hopped out of investment banking and then started doing a couple of operational things and so forth. And then I would say somewhere after the 2007 market crash, I realized that a combination of all of the things that I enjoy exist in human resources, in the sense that so I started off in HR with compensation benchmarking and sort of really quant focused HR things, right? So planning around compensations, coming up with deal structures. I was at a financial services firm there at that time. And then I also, with time, started developing and coaching and so forth, I don't want to say soft skills, that's not the word I'm looking for, but the more employee engagement and employee experience part of that part of me has always been there. And so I do think that from an HR perspective, and again, I'm actually not a fan of HR as a title anymore. I do like companies that are rebranding as people and people teams instead of HR. We're not there yet because we are financial services and it takes us a while to get there. But from the HR piece of it, I've been fortunate that my career has been very strategic because I worked at a company at the time that was building out an HR strategy. And I was working at a financial institution company at the time. And so I think that all of these experiences, but for me, the marriage of all of my skills, operations being a strong one, quant being another one, and employee experience and engagement being probably the third one, has led me to the career that I have, or the point where I am in my career. And in terms of CVC Credit Partners in particular, I left financial services HR and went into tech for some time. And when the opportunity came about at CVC Credit Partners, it was very entrepreneurial, and it still does feel very entrepreneurial. And we were building a structure with a very young population of people. So our employee base, our average age at the time of joining was about 35 years old, which is very young for financial services. And so it gave me an opportunity at CVC Credit Partners to like hone in on my financial services experience in that sector, professional services sector, but still get that startup tech feel of like building out my HR strategy, my team, and my practice. And so, to my point before of, feeling fortunate, it kind of marries everything. So it marries my previous financial services experience, my joy for what I do in terms of my career, but it also gives me the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, strategic, and forward thinking for a very young population of people.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I'm definitely in that kind of mindset as well. And also, you mentioned a variety of different projects and initiatives that oftentimes human resources and people teams have in terms of employee engagement, compensation, retention, creating that company culture, especially as the organization scales too from a global perspective. How do you think about really scaling company culture from an international perspective? I know there's like around 24 plus offices around the world for CVC Credit Partners. What really needs to be kind of local to that office, and what is company wide in terms of your strategy?
Yeah, so for CVC Credit, we don't have a presence of 24. So CVC Capital does have 24 locations. We have a few locations in Europe. We have a large location in New York, and then our biggest location being the UK. So we have Paris, Luxembourg, UK, New York. Yeah, in some of my previous roles, so for example, at Andela, which is where I was prior to CVC Credit, and even at a place called Sagasi, which I was there before. So we had there 23 locations, and in Andela about 7 across Africa and Europe and so forth. So you have 2 questions that you've asked me, right? So the way that I think about scaling company culture was one question, right? And then you'd ask sort of what needs to be local versus not. Was that the second question?
Yes.
So if I had to simplify that, I would say scaling company culture takes intention. And when you're global, you don't have the luxury of thinking that these things are going to happen organically or naturally, because you lose quite a large number of people, right? And you also communicate and message. So I think when I think about sort of 2 ingredients that make that possible, that make scaling culture possible, I would say the first one is coming together in a collaborative space. It could be with culture carriers or with senior leadership, or a combination of both of those things, to align on a set of global values and a mission that drives the entire organization. We did that work for CVC Credit Partners in 2018 and 2019. So that was key for us in terms of scaling our culture, especially across our big offices in the UK and in the US, which were very different culturally and still are respectfully different. But that alignment on mission and values drives what you're doing on a regular basis. Finding spaces and budget to bring people together. So we have a biannual corporate offsite where all of the offices come together. And so pre-COVID, everybody came together in Ireland, and we resurfaced the values right? And so each of the departments got an opportunity to discuss how they're living the values and how they're contributing to the company mission.
Mhm.
And so it was a lot of panels, a lot of presentations, but a lot of like team building sort of activities. And I know a lot of people don't have that luxury now because of COVID, but there are ways of doing some of this digitally. So there's that, again, intention, right? And I think that to answer your second question, what needs to be local and what needs to be, centralized, I think what needs to be local has to be driven by that population and what that population deems to be important. So I was just having this conversation yesterday where as an American who lives in London, right, when everything was going around, when Black Lives Matter was heightened last year around George Floyd, it was very important to me, right? But culturally in the UK, obviously there were protests here, but it wasn't front of mind in the employee space in the way that it was in the US, where it was a much more involved conversation. Companies were required to have, to a degree, not required, but companies were sort of forced to have messaging and a thought and a stance as to how they felt about this particular situation and how they were approaching race. And we did that as well. And we had messaging and we did a lot of things that were very empathetic and so forth. But the point is, remembering or acknowledging that this means something different to our New York office than it may mean to the rest of our offices is incredibly important. Likewise, when everything was going on a few years ago with Brexit, the American offices were like, yeah, they're aware, right? And they're aware of the financial impact, but what's actually happening with the protests in London? What are the things that we need to be messaging to employees? And so it's never easy in terms of deciding what stays local and what stays company-wide, but that North Star piece is always company-wide. And then all of the other things require a feedback loop from that local office. And they should be, whether it's your office managers, your HR people, and I refer to them as culture carriers, but the people who are heavily involved with the employee population, they should have a way of communicating with HR and with leadership to decide what's most important for local offices.
I think that definitely makes sense in terms of your North Star being the values and the mission of the company and goals. And then in terms of execution and engagement for kind of your local team, how you really have that conversation and do that kind of employee listening and engagement. From your perspective, in terms of like a holistic strategy for employee engagement, what does that look like in practice?
I think it's in practice is ever evolving. And I would say it's probably one of those things that if I had to list, I don't know, 5 things that keep me up at night as it relates to work is keeping up with the agility that's required for my job. So holistic employee engagement. I like that, by the way. I haven't heard it referenced in that way. But holistic employee engagement consists of keeping up with how and what is available to you at the moment. And so for us, for example, being a financial services institution, traditionally, we have not employed a model of remote working. We were forced into remote working given the pandemic, right? And so it's made a cultural shift for us in how we communicate and how we engage with employees, in how we hear feedback from employees and how we respond to feedback. We now have quite a large population of people who've never met their managers,
Right.
or managers, or vice versa, right? Managers that have never met in person the people that they work with. We also have people that are tenured who are used to and accustomed to high levels of in-person communication, right? And also there are some generational differences that we have to like respect in terms of how people prefer to communicate, right? That translates to like, I'm now what they call a geriatric millennial, which I'm not comfortable with that. But I am from the generation of people who didn't really have cell phones until they were like in high school. And so there are a couple of times where, not a couple actually, probably on a weekly basis, quite common for me to just want to pick up the phone, right? And I'm used to doing that in an office with an actual phone, not through Teams and not through these other things. And so all that to say is that the strategy for employee engagement is ever evolving. And as someone who's incredibly organized and wants to have a strategy that they put into place, what I've had to learn, and this is the messaging that I've been giving our senior leadership, is we have to give things a try. So right now, what we're going to employ is a hybrid working model where it is manager-led, right? And once it's safe for all of the offices to come back into the office, the plan is 3 days from the office of working and 2 days from home, right? And I have no idea how we're going to measure engagement in that kind of platform, right? I don't know what kind of reward will be rewarded. So if you're the person who decides to come in 5 days a week, you may have a manager that says, that's great, I'm rewarding that more than others. And in not knowing what to expect and how to measure, I'm heavily relying on, and I don't want to endorse any particular brand, but our engagement survey process, right? So as we speak, we currently have a larger than ever commitment to our annual employee engagement survey, as well as the introduction for the first time to a quarterly pulse survey. And we want to live in a world, because we don't know what hybrid is going to bring, because this is constantly evolving, because this is new for our industry. We want to live in a world where we're collecting this data and we are data informed, not driven. And so we're now as an HR team sitting with each of the department heads to review their results from the annual survey, but also bring in the feedback that we've gotten throughout the year from either their particular department, from them, from their cross collaborative departments, to get a full picture on, well, how do people, a holistic picture, to your point, of how do people feel about working here, what's working and what's not. And I think to close the loop on the holistic part of it, what's probably going to be most important right now is, how do we respond? So now we have this information, but what are we actually doing with it? With recognition that we're all, even though I tend to think that there's light at the end of the tunnel in terms of everything going on with like post-pandemic and how we're turning into a normal state of working, whatever that means for anybody. The response on engagement, has to be agile and has to be, so once we have this data, the difficult part is practicing what we say, like committing to, hey, let's give this a try and see how that works. And then not being afraid of asking again, well, how do you feel about it? And recognizing that some people are going to feel great about whatever those changes are, and some people are not. So that's a lot of information, but
no, I agree that this strategy needs to be super dynamic and it's ever changing. I think a lot of times when I speak to leaders in this space too, they're saying business as usual is not cutting it anymore. We need to ask employees, their feedback on the things that we're testing out as well. And really, to your point, to act on it as well. So once we get that information and make really informed decisions. I know earlier kind of we touched on this as well in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, but really want to pass the mic to you to talk about what the goals of CVC Credit Partners diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are there.
Yes, it's on the other side of the spectrum of the things that make me joyful about work. as opposed to keeping me up, is really our leaderships, our leadership team, and and the committed, we have a D&I like working group and committee, right? Their commitment to want to create an inclusive and diverse working space. And very recently, we partnered with MLT. I don't know if you've heard of them, but MLT Leader, it's traditionally a nonprofit organization, but they have a consultant arm where we ran a thorough diagnostic and created, to the point we were talking about before, a mission statement for the organization, as well as some goals to accomplish. And in a recent conversation, so two things that have come from that is fleshing out a really good strategy that works for us. But I think what has been most rewarding for me is us as an organization having a real honest conversation about what our challenges are in the D&I space, and admitting where we have made strong efforts. So we've traditionally made very strong efforts, and we lead in our industry in this space, where we have, in terms of investment professionals, 27% female, and for our sector, that's usually about 17%, right? So we've made strong effort around gender diversity, but now we're pivoting into race, ethnicity, and other identities. Mm-hmm. And with the recognition, this is the part that makes me proud, is with the recognition that we have a long road ahead, and that we're going to inch into how to do this responsibly, and also very transparent and bluntly move that train forward, right? What makes me even happier is our working strategy group, they're self motivated and driven in this space. And it's not coming, or it's interesting that we're having this conversation, because the drive for our DEI strategy is not coming from human resources. And that is the win. Mm-hmm. When the drive is coming from human resources, it puts me as the head of HR in a position where I'm selling something about where the company should be or where the company should go. But the initiative for this is strictly coming from the senior leadership and their desire to mirror the world that we live in. And so with that being said, we have a huge undertaking in terms of representation and increasing representation across our firm. But we also have a lot to celebrate as it relates to events that we have, conversations. We have these series called micro learning sessions, and in all the spaces where these conversations are finally front and center for us. And so that's been really important for us.
I think that's great. I'm definitely in the mindset of two thoughts can exist at the same time, where you're measuring the progress and you're celebrating that, and also saying we have a long way to go, which I think a lot of companies are talking about too, and just testing out, again, strategies and events and programming and just ways to engage folks. I know earlier we were talking about some things that were keeping you kind of up at night, but also, people managers have been kept up at night a lot over this past year, and their role is ever evolving. In your kind of role, how do you think about measuring the effectiveness of people managers?
Also a very good question. You're full of good questions. I will say one more thing on D&I.
Yeah,
and this
absolutely.
is interesting because I get invited to talk on panels and have these discussions. But the one mistake that I do think people make is thinking that they got it right. And anytime you think, oh, my strategy, my D&I strategy, or my metrics or things are right, you're really losing, because there's something that you're not capturing. Right. And so that's the part, like I said, I'm most excited, is that our team is open to that conversation. In terms of my people managers, right? and their roles changing. I would think, aside from the agility, which I've talked about before, I think for the people on my team, what's been the biggest change is recognizing that they have a true responsibility around internal communications, especially post-pandemic. And in our case, we had a restructure as well that was sort of happening in tandem during the time of lockdowns.
Mm.
And realizing that their voice as people managers and just anybody in the people team, not just people managers in general, because we're all responsible for how HR is branded across the organization. We're all, in my team, we're all equally responsible for that. Is realizing that their position at every level to a degree has to be strategic. There's a period of, and I've worked really hard in every group that I've ever led in HR, right? Whether it's this job or previous job,
Right.
Or the job before then, where, you know, I tend to drill to my team that we have to move away from, if you work with a manager, with another leader in another part of the organization that traditionally believes that HR is an administrative function, it is your job, immediate job as a HR person, to educate them and show them by example that your role could be strategic. And I think that with everything that has gone on in the last year, people are recognizing that and holding HR professionals, again, at all levels, to that strategic guidance,
Absolutely.
to supporting them in internal communications and how they move on and move forward with their teams. And so I think that that's been the biggest change, where it's like before we've sold people on the fact that we're not admin. Now people are, wait a second, these are the people responding to how, whether or not we're coming into the office, how we're coming into the office. I now need to loop them into a different kind of conversation. And so that's probably the most effective way of leading people and of being an HR professional or manager who is adding value to the organization as best as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people over this past year are looking to HR and people leaders to have a really large seat at the table and solve, I would say, a lot of problems that are coming up, whether it is in their time or not as well. And there's going to be in the future as well still that seat at the table for folks, because it's a really strategic part of the business for your people. Are there any, when we're talking about these kind of strategies that people are testing out, even with the best intentions, people are bound to make mistakes? So not necessarily at kind of CVC, but in the news or otherwise in the world, are you seeing either leaders or companies kind of make some general mistakes in creating their kind of global HR teams, aside from not being agile and not giving kind of these leaders a seat at the table?
Oh yeah, I see lots of mistakes all the time. I think nine out of the 10 times that I see anything going on with the company, I'm like, who was their HR person? What is going on? Who's managing that? I think actually the biggest mistake that I see happening, you know, with other organizations is not having HR in the room and being thoughtful when they're making statements or taking positions on how the company feels about a piece of news, right? Or how they feel, how they're responding to things that are changing around the world. So, for example, when Juneteenth was announced as a holiday in the U.S., right, it was definitely an opportunity for people to educate their employee pool. If I remember correctly, I think the announcement of approval was on a, let's call it a Tuesday, and the holiday itself was like that Friday or Monday. And there were some firms that were taking really strong positions, like it's too early for us to do any planning around taking the time off. And I can understand that, because administratively that can be burdensome, costly, right? but you still have like a responsibility to communicate with empathy and to lead in that space and say, hey, look, this is a holiday that probably is not celebrated by the majority of my population, but I have to empathize with the fact that it's so important that the government has taken a stance on this, right? And so I saw a lot of mistakes happen with how companies were approaching the delegation of that holiday to their employees. I saw a lot of mistakes around communication and a lot of lack of empathy and understanding, and really putting inclusion first, above maybe a few dollars here and there, or maybe just strategically, workforce planning around a holiday, right? And again, as an HR person, I know that it's not easy. And obviously different organizations have different pain points around, allowing for time off and so forth, but the messaging is key. So going back to that internal comms piece, I think a lot of the times when I see mistakes, in other companies and how they respond to things, I do wonder how collaborative they are when it comes to building out an internal or external message. And I'm incredibly collaborative there because I'm always afraid of saying the wrong thing, either on email or in person, because I'm like, whatever I say, I'm saying as your global head of HR. And so when I'm thinking about a response that perhaps is not something that I personally understand or empathize with, I try to find everybody and anybody who can and should have an opinion, even if it means reaching into departments or people in the organization that I don't have a relationship with. Like, is this important? What should we be saying here? And how should we be responding? And I think if people do just that, they probably avoid some pretty embarrassing moments around response to ever changing things, whether it's climate response or wars and everything that's going on right now in the news and in life.
Absolutely. I think being collaborative, asking again for that feedback is really important. To have that effective communication is really crucial, especially at a company level. On the opposite side, instead of mistakes, is there a positive trend that you're seeing companies and kind of leaders take on in this new world of work as we're navigating this together? Something that you're excited by?
I'm excited about the fact that that people are having dialogues that they just were not having 18 months ago. And I know that definitely leads to, people being afraid of cancel culture, and to a degree, some people feeling like, oh my God, this is leading to censorship or not expressing yourself in the way that you do because you might offend someone, and everybody's so easily offended and so forth. I think it's more important to have difficult conversations around how the world and the world that we live in affects the world that we work in, right? My preference is to have those conversations as opposed to having them live in the subspace and adapt the mentality of, this is what's going on in the world, but this is how I conduct myself at work. Those things no longer are two separate things anymore. They're now one thing, and they're one thing because we're working from home, because this is our office right now, and because the way that the world communicates is changing. So it's scary to one degree because people don't know how to navigate that. But I think this marriage of work and personal beliefs and bringing yourself to work, this new trend, because it is relatively new, especially in financial services, is going to lead to a transformation in culture, not just at my particular firm, but just how we all work in general. So that's the trend that is probably the scariest, but it's the one that mostly excites me because it really brings about what people are and the best in people. I do believe that if you're able to be yourself where you work, whatever that means, you're bringing better results for the organization, right? You're bringing everything that you are, and you're engaged and you're happy and you want to be there. When you're in a place where you're separating those two things, or when they're too separate, that's not going to work anymore.
No, it's definitely not going to work anymore. As you said, our work life and our personal lives and just life in general is definitely blended together. And it is hopeful that we're leaning into these kind of harder, vulnerable conversations too as we're navigating the waters together. Is there anything that I either kind of didn't ask in our conversation that you want to share, or maybe a key kind of takeaway that you hope audience members bring with them after listening to our conversation here today?
No, I think that this conversation was incredibly comprehensive, surprising for me, and a lot of fun, but incredibly comprehensive. And I think we touched on a lot of things: strategy, D&I, trends, and you actually have allowed me to bring myself into this conversation, which is nice and rewarding for me. But if there's anything that you ever have a question about or want my thoughts on, I'm open to spending more time and giving you more of that.
Thank you so much, Merary, for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really enjoyed our conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we believe in that employee feedback management and that everybody's voice really matters to the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.